So today I'm going to be reading from a very old copy of Charles Dickens's Dombey and Son. Let's see if I can show you. There we go. See, Dombey and Son. This is an extremely old edition, a first edition that my boyfriend got for me. It's one of my greatest treasures. Unfortunately, it's really a shame. When it arrived, it was almost completely off the front cover, and it breaks my heart. And so I haven't read it. This is actually a Charles Dickens book that I've never read before. But you know what? Live and let live. I think I really would like to read the book and enjoy its antiquity, and it does me no good just sitting on my shelf. Yeah, I might break it off, but it's almost off anyway, so I'm going to enjoy it, and maybe one day I can get it mended. He wrote someone that said that basically what they'd have to do is put a whole new cover on it, which would absolutely break my heart. So even if I break it off, I may just stick it on the front. So let's read a little bit of this together, and it is just gorgeously aged. It smells good. It's got a lot of splotches on it, and it has these beautiful pieces of artwork. It's upside down, I know, but I'm just going to read from it today with these inserts to keep the ink from spreading to the other side. So this is Dealings with the Firm of Dombey and Son, Wholesale, Retail, and for Exportation by Charles Dickens. It was published in London by Bradbury and Evans on Bovary Street, 1848. That is absolutely amazing. This is over 150 years old. It's incredible. Let's see. What does that say? There's something here. It's backwards. It's odd. Okay. This story, so you can see on the other page where the ink has actually inked, no pun intended, onto the other page. This story is dedicated with great esteem to the Marchioness of Normanby, who's Marchioness? I'm not sure how to say that. Okay. Preface. I cannot forego my usual opportunity of saying farewell to my readers in this greeting place, though I have only to acknowledge the unbounded warmth and earnestness of their sympathy in every stage of the journey we have just concluded. If any of them have felt a sorrow in one of the principal incidents on which this fiction turns, I hope it may be a sorrow of that sort which endears the sharers in it one to another. This is not unselfish in me. I may claim to have felt it at least as much as anybody else, and I would fain be remembered kindly for my part in the experience. Devonshire Terrace, 24th March, 1848. So let's see what this book is about. This is the table of contents, leaking onto the other pages. I just love that. It warms my heart. List of plates right here. And look how absolutely amazing this is. What this does is it lists the errors in the book that they found. So instead of printing a whole new copy with corrections, instead they put these inserts in the front that list the errors. For example, it says page 97, line 23 from top, for the register, read that register. Page 100, line 23 from bottom, for probably, read possibly. I mean, these are like the tiniest little changes. Let's see. We have dull crying to dull cooing, quintius before courteous, auspiciously to suspiciously, the first epistle to the first chapter of the epistle, when you know I want them to when you know why I want them, Saturday to Saturdays, doing to being, a period after the words have reason, and from voice to voices. And then there's even another one here. Instead of downstairs, read above stairs. And for you too, T-O-O, read you too, T-W-O. It's kind of fun. Alright, so let's get this started. I love that. And it's got this, absolutely god-awful pattern. It's god-awful, but I adore it. It's just, I wish you all could touch this. Okay. Dombey and Son, Chapter 1, Dombey and Son. Dombey sat in the corner of the darkened room in the great armchair by the bedside, and Son lay tucked up warm in a little basket bedstead, carefully disposed on a low settee immediately in front of the fire, and close to it, as if his constitution were analogous to that of a muffin, and it was essential to toast him brown while he was very new. Dombey was about 48 years of age, Son about 48 minutes. Dombey was rather bald, rather red, and though a handsome, well-made man, too stern and pompous in appearance to be prepossessing. Son was very bald and very red, and though, of course, an undeniably fine infant, somewhat crushed and spotty in his general effect as yet. On the brow of Dombey, Time and his brother Care had set some marks, as on a tree that was to come down in good time. Remorseless twins they are for striding through their human forests, notching as they go, while the countenances of Son were crossed and recrossed with 1,000 little creases, which the same deceitful Time would take delight in smoothing out and wearing away with the flat part of his scythe, as a preparation of the surface for his deeper operations. Dombey, exulting in the long-looked-for event, jingled and jingled the heavy gold watch chain that depended from below his trim blue coat, whereof the buttons sparkled phosphorescently in the feeble rays of the distant fire. Son, with his little fists curled up and clenched, seemed, in his feeble way, to be squaring at existence for having come upon him so unexpectedly. "The house will once again, Mrs. Dombey," said Mr. Dombey, "be not only in name, but in fact Dombey and Son. Dombey and Son." The words had such a softening influence that he appended the term of endearment to Mrs. Dombey's name, though not without some hesitation, as being a man but little used to that form of address, and said, "Mrs. Dombey, my dear." A transient flush of faint surprise overspread the sick lady's face as she raised her eyes towards him. "He will be cherished, Paul, my Mrs. Dombey, of course." She feebly echoed, "Of course," and rather expressed it by the motion of her lips, and closed her eyes again. "His father's name, Mrs. Dombey, and his grandfather's. I wish his grandfather were alive this day." And again he said, "Dombey and Son," in exactly the same tone as before. These 3 words conveyed the one idea of Mr. Dombey's life. The earth was made for Dombey and Son to trade in, and the sun and moon were made to give them light. Rivers and seas were formed to float their ships. Rainbows gave them promise of fair weather. Winds blew for or against their enterprises. Stars and planets circled in their orbits, to preserve inviolate a system of which they were the center. Common abbreviations took new meanings in his eyes, and had sole reference to them. A.D. had no common with Anno Domini, but stood for Anno Dombey and Son. He had risen, as his father had before him, in the course of life and death, from Son to Dombey, and for nearly 20 years had been the sole representative of the firm. Of those years he had been married, 10, married, as some say, to a lady with no heart to give him, whose happiness was in the past, and who was content to bind her broken spirit to the dutiful and meek endurance of the present. Such idle talk was little likely dutiful and meek endurance. Such idle talk was little likely to reach the ears of Mr. Dombey, whom it nearly concerned, and probably no one in the world would have received it with such utter incredulity as he, if it had reached him. Dombey and Son had often dealt in hides, but never in hearts. They left that fancy wear to boys and girls, and boarding schools and books. Mr. Dombey would have reasoned. that a matrimonial alliance with himself must, in the nature of things, be gratifying and honorable to any woman of common sense, that the hope of giving birth to a new partner in such a house could not fail to awaken a glorious and stirring ambition in the breast of the least ambitious of her sex, that Mrs. Dombey had entered on that social contract of matrimony, almost necessarily part of a genteel and wealthy station, even without reference to that perpetuation of family firms, with her eyes fully open to those advantages, that Mrs. Dombey had had daily practical knowledge of his position in society, that Mrs. Dombey had always sat at the head of his table and done the honors of his house in a remarkably ladylike and becoming manner, that Mrs. Dombey must have been happy, that she couldn't help it. Or, at all events, with one drawback. Yes, that he would have allowed, with only one, but that one certainly involving much. They had been married 10 years, and until this present day on which Mrs. Dombey sat jingling and jingling his heavy gold watch chain in the great armchair by the side of the bed, had had no issue. To speak of, none worth mentioning. There had been a girl some 6 years before, and the child, who had stolen into the chamber unobserved, was now crouching timidly in a corner whence she could see her mother's face. But what was a girl to Dombey and Son? In the capital of the house's name and dignity, such a child was merely a piece of base coin that couldn't be invested, a bad boy, nothing more. Mr. Dombey's cup of satisfaction was so full at this moment, however, that he felt he could afford a drop or two of its contents, even to sprinkle on the dust in the bypath of his little daughter. So he said, "Florence, you may go and look at your pretty brother if you like, I dare say. Don't touch him." The child glanced keenly at the blue coat and stiff white cravat, which, with a pair of creaking boots and a very loud ticking watch, embodied her idea of a father. But her eyes returned to her mother's face immediately, and she neither moved nor answered. Next moment the lady had opened her eyes and seen the child, and the child had run towards her, and standing on tiptoe, the better to hide her face in her embrace, had clung about her with a desperate affection very much at variance with her years. "O Lord bless me," said Mr. Dombey, rising testily, "a very ill-advised and feverish proceeding this, I am sure. I had better ask Dr. Peps if he'll have the goodness to step upstairs again, perhaps. I'll go down. I needn't beg you," he added, pausing a moment at the settee before the fire, "to take particular care of this young gentleman, Mrs. Blockett, sir?" suggested the nurse, a simpering piece of faded gentility, who did not presume to state her name as a fact, but merely offered it as a mild suggestion. "Of this young gentleman, Mrs. Blockett." "No, sir, indeed. I remember when Miss Florence was born." Aye, said Mr. Dombey, bending over the basket bedstead, and slightly bending his brows at the same time. "Miss Florence was all and very well, but this is another matter. This young gentleman has to accomplish a destiny, little fellow." As he thus apostrophized the infant, he raised one of his hands to his lips and kissed it. Then, seeming to fear that the action involved some compromise of his dignity, went, awkwardly enough, away. Dr. Parker Peps, one of the court physicians, and a man of immense reputation for assisting at the increase of great families, was walking up and down the drawing-room with his hands behind him, to the unspeakable admiration of the family surgeon, who had regularly puffed the case for the last 6 weeks among all his patients, friends, and acquaintances, as one to which he was in hourly expectation day and night of being summoned in conjunction with Dr. Parker Peps. "Well, sir," said Dr. Parker Peps, in a round, deep, sonorous voice, muffled for the occasion like a knocker, "do you find that your dear lady is all roused by your visit?" "Stimulated, as it were," said the family practitioner faintly, bowing at the same time to the doctor, as much as to say, "Excuse my putting in a word, but this is a valuable connection." Mr. Dombey was quite discomfited by the question. He had thought so little of the patient that he was not in condition to answer it. He said that would be a satisfaction to him if Dr. Parker Peps would walk upstairs again. "Good. We must not disguise from you, sir," said Dr. Parker Peps, "that there is a want of power in her grace of the Duchess. I beg your pardon, I confound names. I should say in your amiable lady." that there is a degree of languor and a general absence of elasticity which we would rather not see, interposed the family practitioner with another inclination of the head. Quite so, said Dr. Parker Peps, which we would rather not see. It would appear that the system of Lady Cankaby, excuse me, I should have said Mrs. Dombey. I confuse the name of cases. So very numerous, murmured the family practitioner, can't be expected. I'm sure, quite wonderful if otherwise. Dr. Parker Pep's West End practice. Thank you, said the doctor, quite so. It would appear, I was observing, that the system of our patient has sustained a shock from which it can only hope to rally by a great and strong and vigorous, murmured the family practitioner. Quite so, assented the doctor, and vigorous effort. Mr. Pilkins here, who from his position of medical adviser in this family, no one better qualified to fill that position, I'm sure. Oh, murmured the family practitioner, praise from Sir Hubert Stanley. You are good enough, returned Dr. Parker Peps, to say so. Mr. Pilkins, who, from his position, is best acquainted with the patient's constitution in its normal state, an acquaintance very valuable to us in forming our opinions on these occasions, is of opinion with me that nature must be called upon to make a vigorous effect in this instance, and that if our interesting friend, the Countess of Dombey, I beg your pardon, Mrs. Dombey, should not be able, said the family practitioner, to make that effort successfully, said Dr. Parker Peps, then a crisis might arise, which we should both sincerely deplore. With that, they stood for a few seconds looking at the ground. Then, on the motion, made in dumb show, of Dr. Parker Peps, they went up the stairs, the family practitioner opening the door for the distinguished professional and following him out with most obsequious politeness. To record of Mr. Dombey that he was not in his way affected by this intelligence would be to do him an injustice. He was not a man of whom it could properly be said that he was ever startled or shocked, but he certainly had a sense within him that if his wife should sicken and decay, he would be very sorry, and that he would find something gone from among his plate and furniture and other household possessions, which is well worth the having, and could not be lost without sincere regret, though it would be a cool, businesslike, gentlemanly, self-possessed regret, no doubt. His meditations on the subject were soon interrupted, first by the rustling of garments on the staircase, and then by the sudden whisking into the room of a lady rather past the middle age than otherwise, but dressed in a very juvenile manner, particularly as to the tightness of her bodice, who, running up to him with a kind of screw in her face and carriage, expressive of suppressed emotion, flung her arms around his neck, and said in a choking voice, "My dear Paul, he's quite a Dombey." Well, well, returned her brother, for Mr. Dombey was her brother. I think he is like the family. Don't agitate yourself, Louisa. It's very foolish of me, said Louisa, sitting down and taking out her pocket handkerchief. But he's such a perfect Dombey. I never saw anything like it in my life. But what is this about Fanny herself? Said Mr. Dombey. How is Fanny? My dear Paul, returned Louisa, it's nothing whatever. Take my word, it's nothing whatever. There is exhaustion, certainly, but nothing like what I underwent myself, either with George or Frederick. An effort is necessary, that's all. If dear Fanny were a Dombey, but I dare say she'll make it. I have no doubt she'll make it. Knowing it to be required of her as a duty, of course she'll make it. My dear Paul, it's very weak and silly of me, I know, to be so trembly and shaky from head to foot, but I am so very queer that I must ask you for a glass of wine and a morsel of that cake. I thought I should have fallen out of the staircase window as I came down from seeing dear Fanny, and that Tiddy ickle sing. These last words originated in a sudden vivid reminiscence of the baby. They were succeeded by a gentle tap at the door. Mrs. Chick, said a very bland female voice outside. How are you now, my dear friend? My dear Paul, said Louisa in a low voice as she rose from her seat, it's Miss Tawkes, the kindest creature. I could never have got here without her. Miss Tawkes, my brother Mr. Dombey. Paul, my dear, my very particular friend, Miss Tawkes. The lady thus specially presented was a long, lean figure, wearing such a faded air that she seemed not to have been made in what linen drapers call fast colors originally, and to have, little by little, washed out. But for this she might have been described as the very pink of general propagation. propitiation and politeness, from a long habit of listening admiringly to everything that was said in her presence, and looking at the speakers as if she were mentally engaged in taking off impressions of their images upon her soul, never to part with the same but with her life, her head had quite settled on one side. Her hands had contracted a spasmodic habit of raising themselves of their own accord, and as an involuntary admiration. Her eyes were liable to a similar affection. She had the softest voice that was ever heard, and her nose, stupendously aquiline, had a little knob in the very center or keystone of the bridge, whence it tended downwards toward her face, as in the invincible determination never to turn up at anything. Miss Tox's dress, though perfectly genteel and good, had a certain character of angularity and scantiness. She was accustomed to wear odd, weedy little flowers in her bonnets and caps. Strange grasses were sometimes perceived in her hair, and it was observed by the curious, of all her collars, frills, tuckers, waistbands, and other gossamer articles, indeed of everything she wore which would have two ends to it intended to unite, that the two ends were never on good terms, and wouldn't quite meet without a struggle. She had furry articles for winter wear, as tippets, boas, and muffs, which stood up on end in a rampant manner, and were not at all sleek. She was much given to the carrying about of small bags with snaps to them, that went off like little pistols when they were shut up. And when full dressed, she wore round her neck the barrenest of lockets, representing a fishy old eye with no approach to speculation in it. These and other appearances of a similar nature had served to propagate the opinion that Miss Tox was a lady of what is called a limited independence, which she turned to the best account. Possibly her mincing gait encouraged the belief, and suggested that her clipping a step of ordinary compass into 2 or 3 originated in her habit of making the most of everything. "I am sure," said Miss Tox with a prodigious curtsy, "that to have the honor of being presented to Mr. Dombey is a distinction which I have long sought, but very little expected at the present moment. My dear Mrs. Chick, may I say Louisa?" Mrs. Chick took Mrs. Tox's hands in hers, rested a foot of her wine-glass upon it, repressed a tear, and said in a low voice, "Bless you." "My dear Louisa, then," said Miss Tox, "my sweet friend, how are you now?" "Better," Miss Chick returned. "Take some wine. You have been almost as anxious as I have been, and must want it, I am sure." Mr. Dombey, of course, officiated. "Miss Tox, Paul," pursued Mrs. Chick, still retaining her hand, "knowing how much I have been interested in the anticipation of the event of today, has been working at a little gift for Fanny, which I promised to present. It is only a pincushion for the toilette table, Paul, but I do say, and will say, and must say, that Miss Tox was very prettily adapted to sentiment on the occasion. I call Welcome Little Dombey poetry myself." "Is that the device?" inquired her brother. "That is the device," returned Louisa. "But do me the justice to remember, my dear Louisa," said Miss Tox, in a tone of low and earnest entreaty, "that nothing but I have some difficulty in expressing myself, the dubiousness of the result would have induced me to take so great a liberty. Welcome, Master Dombey, would have been much more congenial to my feelings, as I am sure you know. But the uncertainty attendant on angelic strangers will, I hope, excuse what must otherwise appear an unwarrantable familiarity." Miss Tox made a graceful bend as she spoke, in favor of Mr. Dombey, which that gentleman graciously acknowledged. Even the sort of recognition of Dombey and Son, conveyed in the foregoing conversation, was so palatable to him that his sister, Mrs. Chick, though he affected to consider her a weak, good-natured person, had perhaps more influence over him than anybody else. "Well," said Mrs. Chick with a sweet smile, "after this I forgive Fanny everything." It was a declaration in a Christian spirit, and Mrs. Chick felt it did her good. Not that she had anything particular to forgive in her sister-in-law, nor indeed anything at all, except her having married her brother, in itself a species of audacity, and her having in the course of events given birth to a girl instead of a boy, which, as Mrs. Chick had frequently observed, was not quite what she had expected of her, and was not a pleasant return for all the attention and distinction she had met with. Mr. Dombey being hastily summoned out of the room at this moment, the two ladies were left alone together. Miss Tox immediately became spasmodic. "I knew you would admire my brother. I told you so beforehand, my dear," said Louisa. Miss Tox's hands and eyes expressed how much. "And as to his property, my dear—" "Ah," said Miss Tox with deep feeling, "immense." "But his deportment, my dear Louisa," said Miss Tox, "his presence, his dignity. No portrait that I have seen of anyone has been quite so replete of those qualities. Something so stately, you know, some uncompromising thing, so very wide across the chest, so upright, a pecuniary Duke of York, my love, and nothing short of it," said Miss Tox. "That's what I should designate him." "Why, my dear Paul," exclaimed his sister as he returned, "you look quite pale. There's nothing the matter?" "I am sorry to say, Louisa, that they tell me that Fanny—" "Now, my dear Paul," returned his sister, rising, "don't believe it. If you have any reliance on my experience, Paul, you may rest assured that there is nothing wanting but an effort on Fanny's part. And that effort," she continued, taking off her bonnet and adjusting her cap and gloves in a businesslike manner, "she must be encouraged and really, if necessary, urged to make. Now, my dear Paul, come upstairs with me." Mr. Dombey, who, besides being generally influenced by his sister for the reason already mentioned, had really faith in her as an experienced and bustling matron, acquiesced, and followed her at once to the sick chamber. The lady lay upon her bed as he had left her, clasping her little daughter to her breast. The child clung close about her, with the same intensity as before, and never raised her head, or moved her soft cheek from her mother's face, or looked on those who stood around, or spoke, or moved, or shed a tear. Restless without the little girl, the doctor whispered Mr. Dombey. "We found it best to let her have her again." There was such a solemn stillness round the bed, and the two medical attendants seemed to look on the impassive form with so much compassion and so little hope that Mrs. Chick was for the moment diverted from her purpose, but presently summoning courage and what she called presence of mind, she sat down by the bedside and said in a low, precise tone of one who endeavors to awaken a sleeper, "Fanny! Fanny!" There was no sound in answer but the loud ticking of Mr. Dombey's watch and Dr. Parker Pep's watch, which seemed in the silence to be running a race. "Fanny, my dear," said Mrs. Chick with assumed lightness, "here's Mr. Dombey come to see you. Won't you speak to him?" "They want to lay your little boy, the baby, Fanny, you know. You have hardly seen him yet, I think." "In bed. But they can't till you rouse yourself a little. Don't you think it's time you roused yourself a little, eh?" She bent her ear to the bed and listened, at the same time looking round at the bystanders and holding up her finger. "Eh?" she repeated. "What was it you said, Fanny? I didn't hear you." No word or sound in answer. Mr. Dombey's watch and Dr. Parker Peps's watch seemed to be racing faster. "Now, really, Fanny, my dear," said the sister-in-law, altering her position and speaking less confidently and more earnestly in spite of herself, "I shall have to be quite cross with you if you don't rouse yourself. It's necessary for you to make an effort, and perhaps a very great and painful effort which you are not disposed to make. But this is a world of effort, you know, Fanny, and we must never yield, when so much depends upon us. Come, try. I really must scold you if you don't." The race in the ensuing pause was fierce and furious. The watches seemed to jostle and to trip each other up. "Fanny," said Louisa, glancing round with a gathering alarm, "only look at me. Only open your eyes to show me that you hear and understand me, will you? Good heaven, gentlemen, what is to be done?" The two medical attendants exchanged a look across the bed, and the physician, stooping down, whispered in the child's ear. Not having understood the purport of his whisper, the creature turned her perfectly colorless face and dark, deep eyes towards him, but without loosening her hold on the least. The whisper was repeated. "Mamma?" said the child. The little voice, familiar and dearly loved, awakened some show of consciousness, even at that ebb. For a moment the closed eyelids trembled, and the nostril quivered, and the faintest shadow of a smile was seen. "Mamma!" cried the child, sobbing aloud. "Oh, dear mamma! Oh, dear mamma!" The doctor gently brushed the scattered ringlets of the child aside from the face and mouth of the mother. Alas, how calm they lay there! How little breath there was to stir them! Thus, clinging fast to the slight spar within her arms, the mother drifted out upon the dark and unknown sea that rolls round all the world. So that's all I'll read for now, and if you enjoy it, I'll be happy to continue. Thanks, everybody.